Hello everyone. Today in this video I'm going to explain about consumer surplus. What is consumer surplus? To answer this question, we need to learn about the willingness to pay. Imagine that you own a mint condition of a retro shoe from the 80s. Because you are not a shoes fan, you decide to sell it. One way to do this is to hold an auction. For retro fans, shows up to your auction. John, Jacob, George, and Marco. Each of them would like to own that pair of shoes. But there's a limit to the amount of that each is willing to pay for it. Table 1 shows the maximum price that each of the 4 possible buyers would pay. Each buyer's maximum is called his willingness to pay, and it measures how much that buyer values the good. Each buyer would be eager to buy the shoe at a price less than his willingness to pay, and he would refuse to buy the album at a price greater than his willingness to pay. At a price equal to his willingness to pay, the buyer would be indifferent about buying the good. If the price is exactly like the same as the value he places on the shoe, he would be equally happy buying it or keeping his money. To sell your shoe, you begin the bidding at a low price, say $10. Because all 4 buyers are willing to pay much more, the price rises quickly. The bidding stops when John bids $80 or slightly more. At this point, Jacob, George, and Marco have dropped out of the bidding because they are unwilling to bid any more than $80. John pays you $80 and gets the shoes. Note that the shoes has gone to the buyer who values the shoes most highly. You see that John paid $80 for the shoes, yet he's willing to pay $100 for it. The customer surplus is the maximum amount the buyer would willing to pay, that is $100 in this case, minus the actual price, that is $80. That means that the customer surplus is $20. Now, let's see how price affect consumer surplus. In this part of the video, we're gonna use real data from Netflix and Disney and compare the two. In 2021, the Netflix monthly subscription price is around $10, while Disney Plus subscription is around $8 a month. Yet, the willingness to pay for Disney Plus is twice, that is Netflix. That is as seen in this graph here. In 2021, Disney Plus profit $10 billion. Yet, in the same year, Netflix only profit around $214 million. For easier explanation, you can see this graph here. In graph A, the price is P1, the quantity demanded is Q1, and consumer surplus equals the area of the triangle ABC. When the price falls from P1 to P2, as in graph B, the quantity demanded rises from Q1 to Q2, and the consumer surplus rises to the area of the triangle ADF. The increase in consumer surplus, area BCFD, occurs in part because existing consumers now pay less, area BCED, and in part because new consumers enter the market at the lower price, area CEF. So, what does consumer surplus measure exactly? The goal in developing the concept of consumer surplus is to make judgment about the desirability of market outcomes. In most markets, consumer surplus reflect economic well-being. Economists normally assume that buyers are rational when they make decisions. Rational people do the best they can to achieve their objectives, given their opportunities. Economists also normally assume that people's preference should be respected. In this case, consumers are the best judges of how much benefit they receive from the goods they buy. Let's get back to willingness to pay. Using the demand curve to measure consumer surplus is closely related to the demand curve for a product. To see how they are related, let's use another example. On November 11, 2021, in Christie's New York auction house, Van Gogh painting landscape with pollard willows was auctioned. In this example, we will use the three highest bid in the auction. That is number 3 bid, $3,500,000. Number 2 bid, $5,550,000. And number 1 bid, $7,344,500. If the price of that painting is above $7 million, the quantity demanded would be zero, because nobody was willing to pay that high. But if the price is between $5 million and $7 million, the quantity demanded would be 1, because the number 1 bidder would pay for that painting for that price. But if the painting was between the price of $5 million and $3.5 million, the quantity demanded would increase to 2, because number 1 and number 2 bidder would pay for that price because it is below their willingness to pay. This graph shows that the lower the price would go, the higher the quantity for that item would be demanded. But because the item was only 1, it goes to the highest bidder, that is the bidder number 1. As the quantity demanded increase, so does the consumer surplus. This can be measured if we draw the graph like this. The lesson from these examples holds for all demand curves. The area below the demand curve and above the price measures the consumer surplus in a market. This is true because the height of the demand curve measures the value buyers place on the good, as measured by their willingness to pay for it. The difference between this willingness to pay and the market price is each buyer's consumer surplus. Thus, the total area below the demand curve and above the price is the sum of the consumer surplus of all buyers in the market for a good or service. We now gonna talk about market efficiency. Market efficiency refers to how well current prices reflect all available relevant information about the actual value of the underlying assets. The term was taken from a paper written in 1970 by economist Eugene Fama. However, Fama himself acknowledges that the term is a bit misleading because no one has a clear definition of how to perfectly define or precisely measure this thing called market efficiency. These are the key takeaways of market efficiency. First, market efficiency refers to how well current prices reflect all available relevant information about the actual value of the underlying assets. Second, a truly efficient market eliminates the possibility of beating the market, because any information available to any trader is already incorporated into the market price. Third, as the quality and amount of information increases, the market becomes more efficient, reducing opportunities for arbitrage and above market returns. We are now entering the market equilibrium and how to evaluate the market equilibrium. This graph shows consumer and producer surplus when a market reaches the equilibrium of supply and demand. Total surplus, the sum of consumer and producer surplus, is the area between the supply and demand curve up to equilibrium quantity. Recall that consumer surplus equals the area above the price and under the demand curve, and producer surplus equals the area below the price and above the supply curve. Thus, the total area between the supply and demand curves up to the point of equilibrium represent the total surplus in this market. Total surplus in the market is the total value to buyers of the goods, as measured by their willingness to pay, minus the total cost to seller of providing those goods. Now we're gonna talk about market failure. Market failure is the economic situation defined by an inefficient distribution of goods and services in the free market. Each individual makes the correct decision for him or herself, but those prove to be the wrong decisions for the group. In market failure,
The individual incentives for rational behavior do not lead to rational outcomes for the group. Market failure can be caused by a lack of information, market control, public goods, and externalities. Market failures can be corrected through government intervention, such as new laws or taxes, tariffs, subsidies, and trade restrictions. A market failure has a negative effect on the economy due to the non-optimal allocation of resources. In other words, the social cost to manufacture the goods or services, i.e., all the opportunity cost of input resources used in the creation, are not minimized. This also leads to the wastage of resources. There are two major types of market failure. First, complete market failures occurs when the market does not supply any products at all, which results in a missing market. Second, partial market failure happens when the market does not supply products in the correct quantity or at the price consumers want to pay. How is education a market failure? The market for education fails on various accounts to guarantee an efficient allocation of resources and deliver quality education through competition. Not only is the market an imperfect one due to the differentiation in quality of education, but also the social demand for education remain largely unaddressed.
In conclusion, consumer surplus, also called social surplus and consumer surplus in economics, is the difference between the price a consumer pays for an item and the price he would willing to pay rather than do it without it. It is the excess of social valuation of product over the price actually paid. The consumer surplus formula for multiple consumers can be expressed as follows. Consumer surplus equals to half of demand quantity at equilibrium or maximum price buyer is willing to pay minus market price. Producer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference between how much a person would be willing to accept for a given quantity of a good versus how much they can receive by selling the good at the market price. On an individual business level, producer surplus can be calculated using the formula producer surplus equal to total revenue minus total cost. What is the difference between the two? The consumer surplus refers to the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what they paid for a product. Meanwhile, the producer surplus is the difference between the market price and the lowest price a producer is willing to accept to produce a good. Market equilibrium. The equilibrium of supply and demand maximizes the sum of consumer and producer surplus. That is, the invisible hand of the marketplace leads buyers and sellers to allocate resources efficiently. Market failure. Market failure is the economic situation defined by an inefficient distribution of goods and services in the free market. It is when the markets do not allocate resources efficiently in the presence of market failures such as market power or externalities. That's all from me. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See y'all later.